Number 8. Whofort. In the River Medway in Kent, England, a circular structure sits on top of the water known as Whofort. In the 1850s, there were growing concerns of an imminent invasion from France and the UK. Kent was known as an area that was in dire need of extra maritime defenses, as River Medway was wide open to attack. Instead of building along the side of the river, they chose the existing islands that scattered the Medway to establish their new base. The military installation was constructed as a means of defense, and it was completed in 1871. The fort was originally designed with 2 rows of guns aligned in a circle. However, due to extensive costs, only a single tier of 11-inch rifled muzzle-loading guns were built. During the rest of the 1870s, the place was used for gunnery practice. However, the war with France would never come. The castle was not utilized during the First World War. However, it was used as an observation post throughout World War II. Today, the citadel is owned by Medway Ports, and it's still in decent condition. Whofort is no longer battle-ready, and the lower areas have since been flooded in order to keep vandals away. But now the base is open to the public, granted you have a boat to take you there. Number 7. Pjama Castle. Tucked into the side of a mountain in Slovenia, a magnificent 700-year-old palace lies vacant and is known to be one of the most haunted castles in the world. The structure is one of the largest cave-built castles in history, with the building seemingly peeking out of gorgeous natural stone cliffs. The fortress is said to have been built sometime in the 12th century, although there's no historical mention of it until 1274. The legend goes that the palace came under siege by Erasem Luiger, who was a robber baron who resembled a sort of Robin Hood. Like the fictional character, Luiger was known to steal from the rich and give to the poor. However, his attack on Pjama's royal occupants went a little too far. It's said that Luiger slaughtered the Pappenheim family that inhabited the castle at the time, and in the late 15th century, his family took their place, acting as if they were royalty themselves. As fate would have it, Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor of the House of Habsburg, was actually related to the nobleman that Luiger had foolishly murdered, and he planned revenge on the baron. Under siege by the emperor's forces, the usurper was trapped inside the palace. Although he was surrounded, the castle had access to underground tunnels where Luiger would frequently slip in and out of the building to gather supplies from nearby towns. The baron finally met his doom by cannon fire when he was allegedly betrayed by a servant and killed while using the bathroom a year and a day from the start of the siege. After the stronghold was recovered, the Oberburg family took residence there, and the damaged structure was rebuilt around 1510. Sadly, there was a massive earthquake the following year, and it nearly destroyed the whole castle. It wasn't until 1570 that the building was renovated to its current glory. The darker side of the fortress lies in its long history of torture. The building had a horrific dungeon, and there were spaces built between the walls in order to brick people into the integrity of the structure. Inside the castle is a small courtroom which overlooked a small torture chamber. There's also a trap door in the courtroom that leads to a 207-foot drop into the caves below. The bones of those who had fallen down this shaft still lay at the bottom of the trap door, and it's said that the souls of these men and women still haunt Pjama Castle to this day. Visitors also say you can still hear the cries of those trapped inside during the 1511 earthquake, still trying to get out. Number 6. Chateau de Lut Shand. A giant moat guards the 13th century Chateau de Lut Shand, a castle that has survived the French Revolution, a fire, and a British takeover. In the former administrative region along the west coast of France, the palace was built by the Bouquet family in Les Trois Moutiers in Poitou-Charentes. The family of nobles had close ties to the throne, and the French king himself is who they reported to. The castle stood during some of the most politically tumultuous times in French history. The English took over the fortress twice during the Middle Ages, and it was also pillaged during the French Revolution. It wasn't until 1809 when the land and fort were purchased by François Hennequart, a wealthy French businessman. Hennequart was responsible for returning the building to its former glory, and he also planted a vast vineyard on its grounds. The castle was continually passed down to Hennequart's descendants until it was finally given to Baron Edgar Lejeune. The baron renovated the building to its current romantic style, and he frequently held lavish parties within its walls. However, a devastating fire in 1932 destroyed much of the structure. The damages accumulated to a total of over 7 million francs, and from then on the property continued to decay. The amount to reconstruct the stronghold was just too much to bear for any one individual. It wasn't until 2017 when a crowdsourcing campaign launched by locals and the D'Artagnan, a historical preservation company, raised enough money to save the fortress. The Chateau de Lut Shand is now owned by the 7,400 individuals who donated to the cause after raising nearly $600,000, or 500,000 euros. The palace is now open to visitors for a small fee, of course. Number 5. Palace of Sans-Souci. In Millau, Haiti, on top of the site of a former French plantation, a once extravagant citadel called the Palace of Sans-Souci, owned by King Henri Christophe I, now sits in disarray. The palace was built in 1810 but completed in 1813 after Haiti became the first independent Black republic, and many people died during the construction. Once upon a time, the building housed a plethora of expensive parties known for their delicious feasts and dancing. The land was known for its beautiful gardens, man-made springs, and a system of waterworks. The structure had the reputation of having been one of the most magnificent edifices of the West Indies. King Henri I ruled from the palace until 1820, when he shot himself with a silver bullet after suffering a terrible stroke not long before. His son, Jacques-Victor Henri, the only heir to the throne, was murdered only 10 days after the death of his father. Following a massive earthquake in 1842, most of the building was destroyed and the structure was never rebuilt. The mansion was at one time considered to be the Versailles of the Caribbean. However, it's now just a ruined shell of what it used to be. The area is now safe enough to allow visitors, and it stands as a reminder of the luxurious post-revolutionary era. Would you ever stay overnight in an empty haunted castle? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Number 4. Pirti Palace. The Pirti Palace in Ukraine is one of the most frequently visited castles in the area. It's located in the Lviv region, which is adjacent to the village of Pirti. The land was originally owned by the Podgoretsky family, and they built a yard fit to defend them in battle. There was a large wall around the land constructed using large boulders to protect them. The plans for the castle there were not made until Stanislaw Koniecpolski purchased the area in 1633. Koniecpolski was an influential military leader and was second in command to the king himself. At the time, there were several other castles being built for defensive purposes in the region. However, the Pirti Castle was meant to only be a personal residence for the family. Overlooking the Styr River Valley, a site was chosen on top of the Woroniaki Hills for the new stronghold, and the project was given to Andrea del Agua, who was a famous architect. Agua, with the help of Guillaume Levasseur de Beauplan, carried out construction from 1635 to 1640. The finished palace had 2 levels, and they also added a moat surrounding it in order to keep unwanted guests at bay. 2 large columns marked the entrance of the castle, and the surrounding land housed Italian gardens as well as a couple churches and a park full of flowers, fountains, and sculptures. The estate stayed in the Koniecpolski family until the death of the hetman's grandson, and without any heirs, it was consequently given to the family of King Jan III Sobieski. After the castle was in the hands of royalty, restoration work began, and it wasn't finished until 1680, after Sobieski had already passed away. The new owners barely visited the fortress after its reconstruction, and it was bought by Stanislaw Rzuski in 1720. This man was an eccentric collector of weapons, paintings, and books. Even more reconstruction was done to the building by Rzuski's son in order to add more levels, change the shape of the roof, and also update the overall look of the interior to show a more modern style. The castle had multiple owners over the late 1700s to the early 1900s, and eventually was caught in the crossfires during World War II. For a brief period of time, the palace was used as a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients. However, there was a fire in 1956 during a lightning storm that severely damaged the integrity of the building. After the fire, the manor was either abused by trespassers or it sat completely vacant. Although the palace was in ruins, there were various historical movies that were filmed there between the 1960s and the 1980s, like The Three Musketeers and The Wild Hunt of King Stock. After the deserted fortress began to catch the eyes of more and more people, the site was considered a local landmark. In 1997, funds were raised in order to revive Pirti Castle, and it's still currently being worked on today by students of a few nearby colleges in the surrounding area. Number 3. Whofort Castle. Just across the border of Canada on Carleton Island in Cape Vincent, New York, are the crumbling remnants of a haunted, abandoned villa known as Whofort Castle. The manor was built on the small island in the 1980s in order to serve as a vacation home for William O. Whofort, who was a wealthy businessman during the time. Whofort acquired his vast fortune by selling typewriters for E. Remington & Sons, which was an arms manufacturer. With his riches, he began construction for his new estate. However, the man would never be allowed to enjoy it. On his very first night staying in the castle, he suffered a terrible heart attack and unfortunately passed away. Even worse, Wyckoff's wife had reportedly died just 1 month before the building was completed. Ownership of the manor was passed down to the man's son, who had no interest in living in the palace his father had died in. The family's riches were most likely lost in the Great Depression, and the property was then given to General Electric for a brief time in the 1930s. The company planned to use the building as a company retreat, but bad luck seemed to surround the hallowed walls, and during World War II the home was fully abandoned. To this day, nobody has lived in Wyckoff Castle in over 60 years, and it's said that the original owner of the property still resides there today, haunting those who dare to visit. On a high ceiling in one of the rooms, the words "Help Me" are written as an eerily disturbing reminder of the tragedy that occurred there. Just as the Wyckoffs were never able to enjoy their dream vacation home, it seems as though nobody ever will. Number 2. Castle Stalker. On a small island off the west coast of Scotland, there lies a long-abandoned fortress known as Castle Stalker. This structure eerily demonstrates the hectic history of early Scotland. The Lords of Lorne, the aristocratic MacDougall family, ruled the area in 1320, and they originally constructed and owned the fort. However, chaos reigned during this time in history, and in a battle between the MacDougall clan and Robert the Bruce, the King of Scots, the castle underwent a change in ownership. After being defeated by the King of Scots, the land was surrendered to the Stuart family in 1388. Around the 1440s, the Stuarts renovated the fortress to its current form. The Stuarts ruled the area until about 1620, when King James IV visited the castle, and during a drunken bet, the land was then given to Clan Campbell. The Campbells used the castle as a storage house until 1840, when the fortress eventually lost its roof due to poor upkeep. The amazing building on the water sat abandoned until it was bought by Charles Stuart of Acara, who performed conservation work on the land and fort. The castle was fully restored in 1965 after Lieutenant Colonel D.R. Stuart Allward acquired the structure. Castle Stalker is now under private ownership and is accessible to the public during the summer. The fortress was also featured in the 1975 cult classic Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which draws many tourists to the area. Number 1. The Spiss Castle. In eastern Slovakia, a fortress was destroyed during the invasion of the Tartars, and on that hallowed ground, the Spiss Castle was constructed in the 12th century, which now stands as one of the largest castles in all of Europe. The fallen castle was owned by the Hungarian king at the time, and he donated the ruins to the noble Zapolsky family in the second half of the 15th century. They were responsible for rebuilding the once Romanesque palace in a Gothic style, and they also made the structure taller and sturdier than it was before. The castle was well renowned for its beautiful architecture, and it was later home to Jan Zapolsky, the last king to rule Hungary before the Habsburgs' reign. After the change in leadership, the palace was then given to the Turzo family, who rebuilt it in a Renaissance style. The castle was later passed on to the Sakis. However, there was a fire in 1780 that caused the family to flee and abandon the land. They never returned to the site, but they technically held ownership of the palace until 1945. The 900-year-old fortress is now owned by the state and is a highly visited tourist destination. The Spiss Castle is now also a famous historical filming location, and in 1993 it was designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
5. Wilhelm Gustloff. On January 30th, 1945, a German ocean liner was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine and sank in the icy Baltic Sea, killing almost 9,000 people. The Gustloff, named after a Nazi leader who was assassinated in Switzerland back in 1936, was built as a cruise ship for the Nazis' Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy program, which offered recreational opportunities to average working-class German citizens. In 1937, Hitler launched the 680-foot-long, 25,000-ton vessel. The Gustloff was first used by the German military as a hospital, and then as a U-boat training facility after World War II first broke out in 1939. Operation Hannibal, a massive evacuation of German military personnel and civilians, was launched by the Nazis in January 1945 as the Soviet army moved closer to East Prussia. As part of Operation Hannibal, the Gustloff sailed from Goddenhafen in East Prussia to Kiel, Germany on January 30th. The Soviet submarine S-13 quickly saw the Gustloff and fired 3 torpedoes at it. The German liner went down in just 90 minutes, about 12 nautical miles off Stolpbank near Poland. The Gustloff disaster is one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history because, according to current estimates, only about 1,000 of the believed 10,000 people aboard survived. For many reasons, the world learned little about the history of this disaster. The Nazi regime suppressed news of the sinking and censored survivors from spreading the story. A few remained silent because they felt guilty about their German heritage and the war crimes carried out by Nazi Germany against millions of innocent people. 4. The Sultana. The Sultana caught on fire in the Mississippi River during the early hours of April 27, 1865, just days after the Civil War ended. It was a 260-foot-long wooden steamboat built in Cincinnati in 1863 and frequently took passengers and cargo between St. Louis and New Orleans. The ship docked in Vicksburg on April 23, 1865 to tackle boiler problems that had come up during a routine trip from New Orleans. While in the harbor, the US government procured it to transport former Union prisoners of war from Confederate prisons like Andersonville and Cahaba back into Northern Territory. The Sultana's captain, J. Cass Mason, decided to patch the leaky boiler instead of making a more extensive and time-consuming repair in order to fulfill the lucrative contract. Union Army Captain George Williams, who oversaw the whole operation, hastily ordered that all former prisoners at the parole camp and hospital in Vicksburg be quickly transported on the Sultana, out of fears his colleagues were taking bribes to transport prisoners on other boats. Despite being designed to carry only 376 people, the steamboat was packed with over 2,000 Union troops, over 5 times its legal hauling ability. Williams insisted the men travel on one ship, despite objections from several officers who felt the ship would be overloaded if the men were divided. Although the Sultana was steaming up the Mississippi heading north, the severe crowding and fast-moving river current brought on by the spring thaw increased pressure on its recently repaired boilers. On April 27th, shortly after leaving Memphis, Tennessee, the overworked boilers exploded, destroying the center of the vessel and igniting an unmanageable fire. Those who weren't immediately killed by the sharks later died trying to swim to safety. About 200 of the initial survivors were killed as a result of burns suffered during the blow. The Sultana incident is one of the deadliest maritime disasters in American history, according to research, as 1,195 of the 2,200 passengers and crew were killed. 3. MV Dona Pas. The Philippines-flagged passenger ferry Dona Pas set sail from Tacloban, Leyte Island for Manila, with a stop in Catbalogan, Samar, during the morning of December 20, 1987. Sadly, the ferry collided with oil tanker MT Vector at Dumali Point along the Tablas Strait at 10:30 p.m., while most passengers were fast asleep. The Dona Pas was carrying 1,041 tons of gasoline and other petroleum products. The tanker's combustible cargo and the collision ignited a fire that spread quickly on board Dona Pas. After the incident, survivors remembered hearing the crash and seeing the initial explosion, which shook the whole ship and caused panic. There were no lights on board thanks to a blackout, and there were also no life jackets anywhere to be found. With no guidance from the worried crew, passengers had to decide whether to stay on board the burning ship or jump into the flaming waters. It took only 2 hours for Dona Pas and 4 hours for the Vector to sink under the murky waters of the Tablas Strait. A total of 26 people were saved, including 24 from the Dona Pas and 2 crew members from the 13-person crew of the Vector, despite the fact that they were not listed on the ship's actual manifest, and an estimated 4,386 people died in the terrible catastrophe. The majority of these survivors were burned after jumping into the fiery waters. The entire crew of the Dona Pas were killed. The death toll of 4,386 people is still the highest ever recorded in a single maritime incident during peacetime. A series of safety violations led to this fatal incident. The owners of Vector were held responsible in 1999 by the Supreme Court of the Philippines because the ship was investigated and found to be unseaworthy. The boat was also operating without a permit, a lookout, or even a qualified shipmaster. Even though it was the deadliest shipping incident in Philippine history, the sinking of the Dona Pas is only one of the many disasters in the Philippines' extensive maritime history. Notably, there have been 53 shipboard fires, 177 sinkings, and over 80 collisions in the country's waters from 1972 to 1987 alone, when the Dona Pas accident happened. The company who owned the Dona Pas was specifically involved in a total of 4 deadly ship accidents, which were responsible for the deaths of over 5,000 people in just 11 years. Only 10 months later, in October 1988, the sister ship of the Dona Pas, the Dona Marilyn, sank off the coast of Leyte province, killing about 300 people. 10 years later, in September 1998, the ferry Princess of the Orient, which happened to be the sister ship of Dona Pas and Dona Marilyn, sank itself in the stormy seas near Cavite and Batangas, killing close to 200. And another 10 years would pass thankfully without an accident until June 2008, when the Princess of Stars sank 1.8 kilometers from Siboyan Island, killing roughly 800. The ship, which was previously owned by the same company and operated under the name Don Sulpicio, experienced a significant fire in 1979 and was proclaimed a constructive loss. The vessel, however, was renovated and re-entered service as the Dona Pas 2.0. The ship was 24 years old when the accident occurred. Even though the marine investigation and the court decision found that the owner of the Dona Pas was not responsible for the tragedy, the overall body of evidence indicates the company had a history of having a subpar safety culture. The company's CPC was suspended 7 years ago in 2015. It now goes by a different name, offering far fewer cargo services. 2. The White Ship Disaster. William Adlin was the grandson of the infamous William the Conqueror and heir to the thrones of England and Normandy. He passed away on November 25, 1120, at a young age of 17. After setting sail for England, his ship, dubbed the famous White Ship, collided with a giant rock and sank, drowning nearly everyone on board in the chilly waters. This tragedy, which caused the death of the throne's heir, propelled England into a terrible civil war known to historians as the Anarchy. The young man bore the name of his ferocious grandfather, and despite being described by one chronicler as a prince so pampered that he would be destined to be food for the fire, he managed to rule England for about a year before his death, with the help of his able advisors. He married Matilda of Anjou in 1119, securing the boundaries of King Henry's possessions in a strong royal union, despite the fact that the child he married was only 8 years old at the time. He also seemed like he'd be the ideal heir. With so much riding on this young man, his spoiled upbringing seemed understandable in a time when children died very easily. The distress his passing caused also highlights how crucial it was to have a secure line of succession in place back in medieval Europe. As Normandy was considered to be the French's possession, William was made the honorary Duke of Normandy, and in 1120 was required to honor his feudal lord from this land, the King of France himself. King Henry, William's father, was supposed to go as the land's owner, but because he hated the idea of bowing down to any monarch other than himself, he persuaded Louis VI to accept his son's loyalty in his place. After completing this task, William rode back north to meet his father in Barfleur, a Norman port town in the northwest region of France. Henry had made plans to sail home on his own, but Thomas Fitzstephen, a local captain, made William an offer he just couldn't refuse. In a show of royal continuity, Fitzstephen's father, Stephen Fitzgerald, who'd commanded the ship that transported William the Conqueror across the seas, approached the Conqueror's grandson and offered to sail him across the English Channel. Fitzstephen also had a brand new ship that was being refitted that was well known along the coast of the English Channel for its graceful elegance and speed. William and his entourage were ready and willing to be associated with such a glamorous offer and ride aboard the La Blanche Nef, or the White Ship. William's party drank copious supplies of French wine as they boarded, and after much enthusiasm, they started to give the drink out to the crew as well, while Henry sailed ahead on his own royal ship. Some passengers disembarked at this point after some fun. What followed was sadly so easy to predict. After witnessing the king's ship leave, the inebriated men on board yelled at Fitzstephen to push the ship and reach England first, and the captain, who had complete confidence in the speed of his lovely vessel, gladly accepted the challenge. It is unknown exactly how much alcohol he'd consumed at this point. As they hurried out of Barfleur, the crew prioritized speed over safety, paying little attention to the hazardous rocks surrounding the point at Gatville, where there's now a famous lighthouse to prevent modern shipping from making the same fateful mistake. Fitzstephen brought the ship dangerously close to the shore. As a result, it abruptly struck the Quille Boeuf, a submerged hidden rock, and started to sink into the icy water. Panic sparked as the passengers attempted to reach safety, but only a few sober bodyguards remained calm enough to guarantee William made it onto a smaller lifeboat. William was able to grab his half-sister Matilda, who was on board at the time, but when he did, it gave enough time for a group of frantic men to scramble onto the small lifeboat with them. It sank as a result of the weight, killing everyone on board. According to one writer, Fitzstephen survived and made it to the surface, but after learning about William's fate, he chose to plunge back down and take his life instead of facing the wrath of the intimidating and grieving King Henry. The king is said to have never smiled again after receiving the tragic news. Henry ruled for 15 more years and remarried. His first wife, also named Matilda, passed away in 1118 in an attempt to sire another heir. The union created no children, leaving him with only one daughter from his first marriage. His daughter, named after her mother, was very skillful, and after getting married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, she was given the official royal title of Empress. With her benevolent personality and family name, Henry had no reservations about publicly announcing her as his heir. But his misogynistic, power-hungry barons had some other plans. No woman had ever held the throne of England, and Geoffrey of Anjou, Matilda's second husband, was widely hated due to his reputation as a rival. When Henry died in 1135, his nephew, Stephen of Blois, dethroned Matilda, throwing the kingdom into an upheaval and chaos. The barons crowned Stephen as the king, prompting Matilda and Geoffrey to invade Normandy in 1139 to reclaim the throne. This also played a big part in the harsh civil war known as the Anarchy, though some at the time referred to it as the shipwreck. A modern historian, William of Malmesbury, wrote, "No ship that ever sailed brought England such disaster," and the consequences of the White Ship disaster were lengthy, as history reads. 1. The Mont Blanc. On December 6, 1917, the Mont Blanc, a French ship loaded full of explosives and bound for Europe, where World War I was raging at the time, collided with the Emo, which was sailing to New York to pick up supplies for war-torn Belgium. The Mont Blanc caught on fire after the collision and soon came to rest on the Halifax waterfront, where a crowd had gathered to watch it burn down. A significant explosion was caused about 20 minutes after the collision, when the fire ignited the 2,925 tons of explosives the Mont Blanc was carrying. The impact of the blast was so powerful that physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, known as the father of the atomic bomb, later studied it to determine the possible damage the nuclear weapons he was working on might be capable of. The explosion instantly killed dozens of people nearby and devastated the surrounding region, collapsing buildings, setting entire neighborhoods on fire, and even causing a tsunami in the waters. The tragedy was made worse by the fact that a blizzard hit the area that night, which ended up slowing rescue and relief efforts. The Halifax explosion, the deadliest man-made explosion until the first atomic bomb dropped on Japan in 1945, left more than 2,000 people dead, more than 6,000 injured, and about 9,000 people without a home.
Number 4. Third Battle of Ypres. Throughout World War I, the British held important strategic positions in Belgium near the city of Ypres. Determined to seize the advantageous stronghold, the Germans attacked in 1914 in what became known as the First Battle of Ypres. It ended with an Allied victory, but the following year the Germans attacked again in the Second Battle of Ypres, which the British also won. Despite these victories, the Allied forces at Ypres were extremely vulnerable. Surrounded by the Germans on three sides, they were under the constant threat of gunfire. In 1917, they decided to launch an attack in an attempt to push the Germans out of the area for good. After inflicting a preliminary 2-week-long artillery bombardment on the enemy, the British launched a major offensive starting with the Battle of Pilkem Ridge on July 31st. They were able to stop the German advance, but took considerable losses. The fighting continued for over 3 months in what came to be called the Third Battle of Ypres, also known as the Battle of Passchendaele. From early on in the battle, troops faced unusually wet weather that turned the already war-torn area into a swamp. At one point, heavy rains caused the Allies to lose sight of their advancing troops, making it impossible to provide support against the Germans and from moving guns forward. British and French forces were surprised by the Germans' high morale. They put up a stronger fight than the Allies expected, and attacking the Germans on a wide front had left them weakened, exhausted, and at a disadvantage. General Herbert Plumet decided that it was time to try a different approach. He ordered a new attack strategy called Bite and Hold, which involved concentrating heavy gunfire on a small part of the German front line. A second wave of attackers would move in and target the next objective, while the first group of soldiers consolidated the area they had seized and remained on standby as reinforcements. Plumet's plan worked. In just a few days, the Allies made significant gains and delivered a heavy blow to the Germans, who didn't expect to encounter a well-organized and prepared defensive line when they launched their counterattacks. But the battle failed to achieve the Allies' ambitious goal of achieving a war-winning breakthrough. When the fighting ended, they had advanced roughly 5 miles at the cost of more than 250,000 dead, wounded, and missing soldiers. Any gains that the British achieved came with the help of soldiers from numerous countries and parts of the world, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and the Caribbean. The Germans also took major losses, with casualties totaling around 200,000. While the battle amounted to an Allied victory by all technicalities, it didn't end the war. The Germans were worn out, but continued fighting, and the war carried on for another year before they were finally defeated. The violence that occurred outside Ypres throughout the conflict left behind a desolate, barren landscape, littered with destroyed equipment and pockmarked with muddy, water-filled holes. Today, the region is no longer the wasteland that the war had turned it into. Grass and plant life grew back, and wildlife returned. But the reminders of the Ypres battle are ever present, with old trenches, German and Allied bunkers and command posts, a British medical station, and mine craters, some of which have become ponds. Some of the structures have been renovated and are open to visitors, while others have been left to deteriorate. Number 3. Khesan. The U.S. military established a presence in the South Vietnamese village of Khesan in 1962, long before the country's leaders admitted to being directly involved in the developing conflict. Built around a 3,900-foot airstrip, the outpost was located south of the demilitarized zone separating North and South Vietnam. It consisted of 2 ammunition dumps, an air control tower, a Marine Command Patrol Center, and a Special Forces Forward Operating Base. In 1967, the People's Army of North Vietnam, PAVN, increased its presence in the region, indicating possible plans of an upcoming attack and leaving General William Westmoreland, President Lyndon B. Johnson, and other leaders with the question of whether to abandon or strengthen the base. Some politicians and officials worried that defending Khesan could prove to be an expensive and embarrassing loss. But Westmoreland and Marine Corps General Rat Von Tompkins had their sights set on staying put and defeating the North Vietnamese in the event of an attack. In an effort known as Operation Niagara, they reinforced the base with additional Marines, stocked up on ammunition, and refurbished the garrison's airstrip. Using some of the world's most advanced surveillance technology, the military worked to pinpoint North Vietnamese military strongholds and began bombing the suspected locations. At the peak of the siege, American planes dropped 3 times the tonnage of bombs that were delivered on peak days during World War II. Infantrymen who patrolled the perimeter at Khesan were backed by tank and anti-tank units and an artillery battalion. Outside the base, Marines held 2 hills, a radio relay station on another hill, and a hill overlooking the Rao Quan River Valley. In the meantime, the North Vietnamese secretly fortified a chain of hills directly outside Khesan. Around 5:30 a.m. on January 21, 1968, they attacked the outpost with a massive artillery bombardment, destroying 90% of the Americans' ammunition store and sparking an intense 77-day battle. 18 men were killed and 40 were wounded in the initial barrage, and the explosions continued uninterrupted for another 2 days. The Marines fought back and called in air support. They predicted a massive North Vietnamese ground attack and prepared accordingly. Instead, the North Vietnamese attacked Khesan village 3 miles outside the base. American and South Vietnamese forces responded swiftly, thwarting PAVN's attempt to take the village before evacuating it later that day. The North Vietnamese continued to attack the combat base, causing extensive damage while the Marines had more ammunition delivered and bolstered their reinforcements. President Johnson grew concerned about whether it was wise to continue fighting or if it would be smarter to withdraw, but he allowed Westmoreland to carry on with the battle. American bombers launched round-the-clock strikes over suspected North Vietnamese camps in the region, dumping tons of bombs from B-52s every 90 minutes and annihilating the PAVN's suspected Army headquarters for the Khesan offensive in the process. By the end of the battle, U.S. forces had dropped over 57,000 tons of bombs on the North Vietnamese. The full-force attack that military officials expected from the PAVN never came. The Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive in more populated areas of South Vietnam, including the city of Saigon, leading to the suspicion that the attack at Khesan was a diversionary tactic meant to distract the Americans. Westmoreland defended his decision to defend Khesan, but nevertheless decided that the base was no longer strategically necessary and ordered its evacuation after 2.5 months of fighting. Today, the site contains a small museum. The remains of bunkers, a drainage system, and other infrastructure stand as an eerie reminder of the controversial battle, which many Americans grew to see as a pointless loss of lives spent defending an area that was simply left behind after 11 weeks of brutal violence. Number 2. Battle of Trenton. Photography didn't exist yet when the American Revolution took place between 1765 and 1783, leaving us to rely on paintings, descriptions, and our imaginations when it comes to picturing what the war looked like. One of the most famous depictions of the Revolution shows George Washington crossing the icy Delaware River in a small boat on Christmas night in 1776. While that did actually happen, the iconic painting is not thought to be an accurate reflection of the event. Created in 1851 by German-American artist Emanuel Lutz, it's an impressive nod to the American spirit that ultimately won the war. But the Delaware crossing probably looked more like this painting, created in 2011 by historical artist Mort Kunstler. It was commissioned by the U.S. Congressman and Revolutionary War buff Tom Ssui, who wanted an image that accurately portrays a low point in the American fight for freedom. Unlike Lutz's painting, Kunstler's piece conveys the desperation that Washington and his supporters felt as they crossed the river on a flatboat ferry on the frigid, snowy night. The beleaguered general and 2,400 of his troops made the crossing from Pennsylvania to New Jersey to launch a surprise attack against Hessian forces who were stationed near the river in Trenton. After months of defeats, Washington's morale was at an all-time low, and he needed to secure a victory to turn the war in favor of the colonists and to restore his hope of winning. They reached New Jersey just before dawn and descended on Trenton. By 9:30 a.m., the Patriots had surrounded the town. The Hessians, German soldiers who were fighting in support of the British, were caught off guard. They had underestimated the likelihood of an attack amid the recent spate of major British victories. Around 400 Hessians escaped, but Washington's forces managed to capture 1,000 men with only 4 lives lost. Unfortunately, because a reinforcement regiment had failed to arrive on time, the Patriots were forced to withdraw. The Battle of Trenton didn't end in the sweeping victory that Washington had hoped for, but this small and lesser-known battle provided American colonists with a much-needed morale boost at a time when they had begun to doubt the Continental Army's capabilities. Today, the site where Washington and his troops entered the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware is part of the Washington Crossing Historic Park. Visitors can see firsthand where the Patriots departed, and the crossing is occasionally even reenacted in full Revolutionary costume. The site where the Battle of Trenton took place is marked by a 150-foot-tall monument that was built during the late 19th century. It's topped by a 13-foot bronze sculpture of Washington. The monument sits at an intersection known as the 5 Points, which is precisely where Washington's forces carried out their swift and unexpected attack on the Hessians. Campaigns to erect a monument in honor of the Continental victory began as early as 1843, but it took another 50 years before this vision was brought to life with funding from Congress and donations from members of the public. Number 1. First Barbary War. When President Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated in 1801, relations between the United States and North Africa's Barbary states were becoming increasingly strained. The Barbary states consisted of the independent Kingdom of Morocco and the Ottoman regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. They participated in state-supported piracy and held captives for ransom. But American ships were a major target, and Jefferson was unwilling to pay the tributes that the Barbary states demanded in order to make the thefts and kidnappings stop. Tripoli was already at war with Sweden when it declared war on the United States. By then, Jefferson had sent 4 ships with gifts and letters in a diplomatic attempt to maintain peace with the Barbary states. The fighting continued along the Tripoli shore for the next 4 years. In 1803, the American naval vessel USS Philadelphia ran aground while patrolling off the Tripoli coast. Captain William Bainbridge tried to refloat the ship, ordering the crew to throw some of their heavy items overboard to lighten the vessel as much as possible. But his attempts failed, and he knew it was only a matter of time before Tripoli pilots caught up with the ship. The crew destroyed essentially everything on board so that it was of no use. He then surrendered. Bainbridge and his men were enslaved by the Tripolitans, who managed to refloat the ship. American officials didn't think that the enemy deserved to have the Philadelphia in their possession. Early the next year, the Marines lured the pirates to one of their ships and set the vessel on fire. The war finally turned in favor of the U.S. in 1805 when American Army officer William Eden and Marine Corps First Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon led 8 Marines and 500 mercenaries from various countries across the desert on foot from Alexandria, Egypt, to the Tripolitan city of Derna. They captured Derna with relative ease and raised the American flag in victory on foreign soil for the first time. It gave the U.S. significant negotiating power, and the First Barbary War officially ended in June 1805 with the signing of the Treaty of Tripoli. Today, Tripoli is the capital of Libya. The bustling city is home to 2 million residents, and the coastline has changed considerably since the war. Rather than being lined with palm trees, the landscape is dominated by high-rise buildings. The once pristine shoreline has also become polluted with sewage and garbage to the point of posing severe public health risks. Thanks for watching. Which of these historic battlefields would you like to visit? Tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you for another amazing video right here on American Eye.